Do you remember Christmas morning when your mother stood in the kitchen before dawn, transforming almost nothing into something? The table she set held foods you'd never see today.
Smell that bread. The staff of life, energy, cooked by electrical energy.
But in the 1950s, 50 foods appeared at every Depression Christmas table. By 1968, 30 remained. Today, families make fewer than 5. Tonight, we document all 50 before the last generation who survived the Depression dies. Walk into any Depression kitchen on Christmas Eve, and you'd find mothers making water pie, a dessert so impossible it seemed like magic, creating pie filling from water, sugar, butter, and flour with no eggs, milk, or fruit. This miracle cost about 10 cents and fed 6 people with pie that somehow tasted sweet and satisfying despite containing almost nothing. Mothers made water pie by mixing water with sugar and butter in an unbaked pie shell, sprinkling flour on top, then baking until the ingredients mysteriously combined into something resembling custard. The chemistry seemed impossible. Water and flour should create paste, not pie, but slow baking transformed the simple ingredients into filling that set and sliced. The pie tasted plain compared to fruit pies, but plain was better than nothing, and the fact that it existed at all felt like victory. Children who ate water pie remembered it as proof that Christmas happened even when money didn't. Potato candy brought sweetness to Christmas through mashed potatoes mixed with powdered sugar, creating confection that contained no chocolate, cream, or expensive ingredients. This clever creation cost about 5 cents and produced 2 dozen candies that looked like petit fours but were made from leftover mashed potatoes. Mothers made potato candy by mixing cold mashed potatoes with enough powdered sugar to create stiff, dough-like mixture, rolling it thin, spreading it with peanut butter, then rolling it up and slicing it into pinwheels. The potato disappeared completely into the sugar, creating candy that tasted sweet and rich without any hint of vegetable. The candy required no cooking, making it safe for children to help make, creating Christmas activity that kept kids occupied while mothers worked on more complicated dishes. The fact that candy came from potatoes seemed like magic to children who couldn't believe vegetables could become treats. Milk toast appeared at Christmas breakfast in homes where eggs and bacon were too expensive, creating warm, filling meal from bread, milk, butter, and sugar. This humble breakfast cost about 3 cents per person and provided warmth and calories that got families through cold Christmas mornings. Mothers made milk toast by toasting bread until crispy, placing it in bowls, then pouring hot milk sweetened with sugar and enriched with butter over the toast. The toast softened in the hot milk, creating texture somewhere between cereal and pudding that was comforting and filling. The dish had to be eaten immediately. Waiting made the toast soggy and unappetizing, so families gathered around the table together, eating quickly while the toast was still slightly crispy on top and soft underneath. The shared timing created family moment that turned simple food into ritual. Prune whip transformed dried prunes into elegant dessert through beaten egg whites, creating fluffy topping that made humble fruit seem fancy. This economical creation cost about 15 cents and fed 8 people with dessert that looked impressive despite simple ingredients. Mothers made prune whip by cooking dried prunes until soft, mashing them smooth, then folding the prune puree into stiffly beaten egg whites. The egg whites lightened the dense, dark prunes, creating pale purple mixture that was airy and sweet. The whip had to be served immediately after making, or the egg whites deflated and the mixture became dense and unappealing. This timing requirement meant prune whip appeared at Christmas dinner itself rather than being made ahead, adding to the day's work but creating results that seemed special and celebratory. Fried mush brought variety to Christmas breakfast through leftover cornmeal, mush sliced and fried until crispy outside and soft inside. This thrifty creation cost almost nothing because it used mush made the day before, demonstrating that leftovers could become new dishes rather than just reheated food. Mothers made fried mush by cooking cornmeal with water and salt until thick, pouring it into a loaf pan to cool and set overnight, then slicing the firm mush and frying the slices in bacon grease or butter until golden and crispy. The frying transformed soft, plain mush into something with textural interest and rich flavor from the fat. The mush was served with syrup or molasses, creating sweet breakfast that cost pennies and filled hungry stomachs. Children who grew up eating fried mush remembered it as Christmas morning food that made the day feel special even when money was scarce. 5 foods down, 45 ahead. You've watched water become pie, potatoes transform into candy, bread soak in sweetened milk, prunes lighten with beaten egg whites, yesterday's mush become today's breakfast.
Put it in a casserole, edge with 1/4 cup of breadcrumbs, mixed with 1 tablespoon of melted butter.
Depression. Mothers were alchemists, turning scarcity into celebration, proving that Christmas didn't require wealth, just ingenuity and refusal to surrender joy. 45 more foods reveal what poverty taught them. Mock chicken brought the illusion of poultry to Christmas tables through pork shoulder cut and cooked to resemble chicken when real chicken was unaffordable. This deceptive creation cost about 35 cents and fed 6 people with meat that looked like chicken pieces and tasted similar enough to satisfy children who'd been promised poultry for Christmas. Mothers made mock chicken by cutting pork shoulder into pieces resembling chicken parts, coating them in seasoned flour, then frying or baking until golden and crispy. The coating and cooking method created appearance and texture similar to fried chicken, while the pork's mild flavor didn't announce itself as obviously different. The deception worked best with children who didn't know chicken well enough to detect the substitution. Adults knew they were eating pork, but appreciated the effort to make Christmas dinner feel special and traditional despite economic constraints. Carrot marmalade transformed garden vegetables into sweet spread that resembled orange marmalade when citrus was too expensive. This clever creation cost about 10 cents and produced several jars of spread that looked golden and festive, fooling guests who expected expensive imported preserves. Mothers made carrot marmalade by cooking grated carrots with sugar, lemon juice, when available, and orange extract until thick and jam-like. The carrot's natural sweetness intensified during cooking, while the orange extract created citrus flavor that masked the vegetable origin. The marmalade was served with Christmas morning toast or biscuits, creating special breakfast that seemed luxurious despite humble ingredients. The golden color looked festive and holiday appropriate, announcing that this was special occasion food rather than everyday spread. Carrot marmalade taught children that vegetables could be sweet, that appearances could be deceiving in good ways, and that creativity could create treats from unexpected sources. Bread pudding brought elegance to Christmas dessert through stale bread transformed into rich custardy pudding topped with hard sauce that made simple ingredients seem sophisticated. This economical creation cost about 20 cents and fed 8 people with dessert that tasted expensive despite using bread that would otherwise be thrown away. Mothers made bread pudding by soaking stale bread in milk until soft, mixing it with eggs, sugar, butter, and vanilla, then baking until set and golden. The hard sauce, butter and powdered sugar beaten until fluffy, flavored with vanilla or brandy extract, was served alongside, melting into the warm pudding. The pudding rescued bread that was too stale to eat plain, demonstrating the waste-nothing philosophy that characterized Depression cooking. The transformation from stale bread to elegant dessert seemed almost miraculous, teaching children that food's potential wasn't limited by its current state. Bread pudding appeared at Christmas dinner in households where mothers had saved bread scraps for weeks, creating dessert that cost almost nothing, but that tasted rich and satisfying, proving that luxury wasn't about expensive ingredients, but rather about proper technique and presentation. Chicken feet soup brought nutrition to Christmas dinner through parts that butchers gave away free, creating rich broth that provided warmth and sustenance when meat was unaffordable. This resourceful creation cost nothing if you knew which butchers to ask, and fed 8 people with soup that was nourishing despite its humble origins. Mothers made chicken feet soup by cleaning chicken feet thoroughly, simmering them for hours until the bones released their gelatin and the broth became rich and thick. Vegetables, onions, carrots, celery, were added along with any available scraps, creating soup that was filling and warming. The feet had to be cleaned carefully, with the outer skin removed and nails trimmed away, creating work that separated mothers willing to do anything to feed their families from those who couldn't overcome squeamishness about using parts that seemed like garbage. Chicken feet soup appeared in homes where mothers understood that nutrition came from bones and connective tissue as much as from meat, where nothing was wasted and where pride took second place to feeding hungry children during the hardest economic times America had known. Sugar cookies without eggs brought Christmas baking to homes where eggs were too expensive or being saved for dishes that required them more critically. This adapted recipe cost about 15 cents and produced 3 dozen cookies that looked and tasted nearly normal despite missing a key ingredient. Mothers made eggless sugar cookies by creaming butter and sugar, adding milk and vanilla, then mixing in flour and baking powder to create dough that held together without eggs. The cookies spread more during baking than regular sugar cookies and had slightly different texture, more crisp, less chewy, but they were recognizably Christmas cookies. The cookies could be decorated with colored sugar or simple icing made from powdered sugar and water, creating festive appearance that announced Christmas despite the recipe's compromises. Children who ate eggless sugar cookies didn't know they were different from real cookies, allowing mothers to maintain Christmas traditions despite shortages. 10 foods down, you're seeing substitution mastery. Pork pretending to be chicken, carrots becoming citrus spread, stale bread transforming into pudding, chicken feet creating nourishing broth, cookies succeeding without eggs. These weren't compromises, they were innovations born from necessity. Milk gravy appeared on Christmas tables as white sauce that made biscuits, potatoes, or bread feel like complete meal when meat was absent or too scarce to serve everyone. This filling creation cost about 5 cents and stretched small amounts of food into full plates through sauce that added richness and calories. Mothers made milk gravy by creating roux from flour and bacon grease, cooking until golden, then gradually adding milk while stirring constantly to prevent lumps. The gravy thickened as it cooked, creating smooth, rich sauce that coated whatever it was poured over. The bacon grease provided flavor that suggested meat even when none was present, creating the illusion of richer meal than reality. The milk added calories and protein that helped fill stomachs when portions were small and second helpings impossible. Milk gravy appeared at Christmas breakfast over biscuits, creating biscuits and gravy that was filling enough to last until dinner. The same gravy appeared at dinner over mashed potatoes or bread, demonstrating its versatility and economy. The gravy represented Depression-era understanding that fat and starch could create satisfaction. that richness came from technique rather than expensive ingredients, and that simple white sauce, properly made, could transform plain food into something that felt abundant and celebratory. Children who grew up eating milk gravy remembered it as comfort food that appeared when times were hardest. Salmon croquettes brought fish to Christmas tables through canned salmon stretched with breadcrumbs and potatoes, creating patties that made one small can feed 6 people. This economical creation cost about 25 cents and provided protein when fresh meat was unaffordable. Mothers made salmon croquettes by mixing canned salmon with mashed potatoes, breadcrumbs, eggs when available, and seasonings, forming the mixture into patties and frying them until golden and crispy. The potatoes and breadcrumbs stretched the expensive canned salmon, creating more servings than the salmon alone would provide. The croquettes were served with white sauce or ketchup, creating complete meal that felt special despite economical ingredients. The crispy exterior and tender interior created textural interest that made the simple patties seem more sophisticated than they were. Salmon croquettes appeared at Christmas dinner in households where fish was more affordable than meat, where mothers understood that canned goods could be stretched through proper technique, and where creating the appearance of abundance mattered even when portions were small. The croquettes taught that 1 can of salmon could feed a family if properly extended, that starch could stretch protein without making it seem skimpy, and that frying created appeal that made simple ingredients seem special. The golden brown color announced that this was celebratory food rather than everyday meal, demonstrating that presentation mattered as much as ingredients in creating the feeling of celebration. Dandelion greens brought vegetables to Christmas tables through foraged weeds that cost nothing and provided nutrition when store-bought vegetables were unaffordable. This free food fed 8 people with greens that tasted bitter, but provided vitamins that prevented deficiency diseases. Mothers gathered dandelion greens from yards and fields, selecting young leaves before flowers appeared because older leaves were too bitter to eat, even when desperate. The greens were washed thoroughly, then cooked with bacon grease or salt pork until wilted and tender. The greens had to be cooked properly to reduce bitterness. Boiling in 2 changes of water removed some of the bitter compounds, making them more palatable. The bacon grease added flavor and fat that made the greens more appealing and more filling. Dandelion greens appeared at Christmas dinner in rural households where foraging was normal and where free food was too valuable to ignore regardless of whether it was traditional Christmas fare. The greens demonstrated that nutrition could be gathered rather than purchased, that weeds were food to those who knew what to look for. The greens taught children to identify edible plants, to understand that food grew everywhere for those with knowledge, and that weeds was a judgment rather than a fact. Fried apples brought fruit to Christmas breakfast through apples cooked in butter and sugar until caramelized and tender. This simple side cost about 15 cents and created fruit dish that felt special and celebratory, despite requiring only 3 ingredients. Mothers made fried apples by slicing apples thin, cooking them in butter and sugar over medium heat until the apples softened and the sugar caramelized, creating sweet, tender fruit with slightly crispy edges. The cooking concentrated the apples' flavor and sweetness, making them taste more intense and special than raw apples. The apples were served alongside breakfast meats or over pancakes, creating sweet component that balanced savory foods. The caramelized sugar created shiny coating that looked festive and appealing, announcing that this was special occasion food. Fried apples appeared at Christmas breakfast in households where apples were available, either from family orchards or purchased cheaply in fall and stored through winter. The apples represented one of the few fruits available in winter before modern refrigeration, and shipping made all fruits available year-round. The dish taught that cooking could transform ingredients, that sugar and butter could make simple fruit seem luxurious, and that presentation mattered. Fried apples looked and tasted more special than raw apples, even though the ingredient cost was similar. The transformation from raw to cooked, from plain to caramelized, demonstrated that technique created value beyond just ingredients. Crackling bread brought pork flavor to Christmas meals through cracklings, the crispy bits left after rendering lard, mixed into cornbread batter. This economical creation cost about 10 cents and used parts of the pig that might otherwise be discarded, demonstrating complete utilization of every ingredient. Mothers made crackling bread by mixing cracklings into cornbread batter before baking, creating bread studded with crispy, fatty pork pieces that added richness and protein to plain cornbread. The cracklings had to be chopped small enough to distribute evenly throughout the bread, without creating huge chunks that were too fatty to eat comfortably. The bread was richer and more filling than plain cornbread, with the pork fat creating moist texture and the crispy bits adding textural interest. The bread could serve as side dish or as main course when served with beans or greens, demonstrating its versatility. Crackling bread appeared in households where pigs were butchered at home and where every part of the animal was used, where nothing was wasted, and where the byproducts of other processes, like lard rendering, became ingredients rather than garbage. The bread taught that waste was a choice rather than a fact, that creativity could find uses for everything, and that the most economical cooking meant using all parts of all ingredients. The cracklings represented the difference between throwing away and transforming, between seeing garbage and seeing potential ingredients. 15 foods down, 1/3 complete. Flour and milk creating gravy, canned salmon feeding 6, yard weeds providing vitamins, apples caramelizing in sugar, pork scraps enriching cornbread. Depression mothers were resourceful beyond modern comprehension, seeing potential where others saw garbage, creating abundance where others saw scarcity. 35 more foods reveal their complete survival system. Peanut butter soup brought protein to Christmas dinner through peanut butter thinned with milk and broth, creating unusual soup that provided nutrition when meat was unaffordable. This strange creation cost about 20 cents and fed 6 people with soup that was filling and protein-rich, despite its odd flavor combination. Mothers made peanut butter soup by mixing peanut butter with hot milk or chicken broth, stirring until smooth, then seasoning with salt, pepper, and sometimes onion. The soup was thick and rich, coating the spoon and providing calories and protein that helped fill hungry stomachs. The soup tasted unusual, neither sweet nor fully savory, with peanut butter flavor that seemed wrong in soup format to modern palates. Apple butter brought sweetness to Christmas morning through apples cooked down with sugar and spices until thick and spreadable. This preserved creation cost about 30 cents to make in fall and lasted through winter, providing sweet spread that made plain bread feel special. Mothers made apple butter by cooking apples with sugar, cinnamon, and cloves for hours until the mixture darkened and thickened, creating spread that was concentrated apple flavor. The long cooking, often 6 to 8 hours, required attention and stirring to prevent scorching, but created results that lasted months without refrigeration. The apple butter was canned in fall when apples were abundant and cheap, then stored until Christmas when it appeared on breakfast tables alongside biscuits or toast. The dark brown color and intense flavor announced that this was special spread, not just applesauce. Baked beans with molasses brought substantial main dish to Christmas dinner through navy beans, slow-cooked with molasses and salt pork until thick and rich. This filling creation cost about 30 cents and fed 10 people with beans that were hearty enough to be the meal's centerpiece when meat was unaffordable. Mothers made baked beans by soaking navy beans overnight, then baking them with molasses, brown sugar, mustard, and chunks of salt pork for 6 to 8 hours at low temperature. The long, slow cooking broke down the beans and allowed flavors to meld, creating dish that was sweet, savory, and deeply satisfying. The beans had to be checked periodically, and water added if they started to dry out, requiring mothers to be home all day while they cooked. This time, investment was accepted as normal part of holiday preparation, demonstrating that creating filling, economical meals required patience and attention. Vinegar taffy brought candy to Christmas through sugar cooked with vinegar until it reached hard crack stage, creating candy that could be pulled into glossy ropes. This economical treat cost about 15 cents and produced enough candy to fill a small tin, providing sweets when store-bought candy was impossible. Mothers made vinegar taffy by cooking sugar, vinegar, and butter until the mixture reached 270 degrees, then pouring it onto buttered plates to cool until it could be handled. The warm candy was pulled repeatedly, stretching and folding it until it became lighter in color and developed glossy sheen. The pulling required strength and created family activity, with children old enough to handle hot candy helping to pull the taffy. The pulling incorporated air that made the candy lighter and created texture that was satisfying to chew. Liver and onions brought inexpensive meat to Christmas dinner through organ meat that cost a fraction of muscle meat's price. This nutritious creation cost about 25 cents and fed 6 people with meat that was rich in iron and vitamins despite being the cheapest protein available. Mothers made liver and onions by slicing beef liver thin, dredging it in seasoned flour, then frying it quickly with sliced onions until just cooked through. The liver had to be cooked briefly. Overcooking made it tough and intensified its strong flavor, requiring timing and attention that separated properly cooked liver from rubbery, unpleasant meat. The onions sweetened as they cooked, creating flavor that balanced liver's mineral taste and making the dish more appealing. The onions also created sauce that moistened the liver and made it easier to eat. Liver and onions appeared at Christmas dinner in households where nutrition mattered more than preference. 20 foods down, 30 remaining, peanut butter becoming soup, apples preserved from fall harvest, beans baking for 8 hours, vinegar creating candy, organ meat providing iron. These mothers understood nutrition, preservation, and the chemistry of cooking in ways that kept families healthy when poverty threatened survival itself. 30 more foods complete their Depression Christmas table. Mock oyster stew created the illusion of expensive seafood through salsify, a root vegetable that tasted vaguely like oysters when properly prepared. This clever deception cost about 20 cents and fed 6 people with oyster stew when real oysters were impossibly expensive. Mothers made mock oyster stew by peeling and slicing salsify roots, cooking them in milk with butter, salt, and pepper until tender. The salsify's subtle oyster-like flavor, combined with the creamy milk base, created stew that resembled real oyster stew closely enough to satisfy children who'd never tasted real oysters. Beet greens. Beet greens brought vegetables to Christmas tables through the leafy tops that were usually discarded, creating free vegetable when buying the beetroots. This zero-cost addition fed 8 people with greens that were nutritious and flavorful despite being considered garbage by those who didn't know better. Mothers cooked beet greens by washing them thoroughly, then wilting them in a hot pan with bacon grease or butter until tender. The greens cooked down significantly, with large bunches reducing to small servings, requiring many beets' worth of tops to feed a family. The greens had to be young and tender. Old greens were tough and bitter, requiring mothers to select beets carefully and to use the greens immediately rather than storing them. Cornmeal mush brought hot cereal to Christmas breakfast through cornmeal cooked with water and salt until thick and porridge-like. This filling creation cost about 3 cents per person and provided warm breakfast that stuck to ribs and kept children full until dinner. Mothers made cornmeal mush by slowly adding cornmeal to boiling salted water while stirring constantly to prevent lumps, then cooking until the mixture thickened into smooth porridge. The mush had to be stirred frequently to prevent sticking and scorching, requiring attention but creating results that were filling and warming. The mush was served hot with butter and molasses or sugar, creating sweet breakfast that was substantial enough to be satisfying. Cabbage rolls stretched small amounts of meat into full meal through cabbage leaves, wrapped around filling of ground meat mixed with rice or bread. This economical creation cost about 40 cents and fed 8 people with rolls that made 1 pound of meat serve as many people as 3 pounds of meat would normally feed. Mothers made cabbage rolls by blanching cabbage leaves until pliable, filling them with mixture of ground meat, cooked rice, onions, and seasonings, rolling them tightly, and baking them in tomato sauce until tender. The cabbage provided bulk that stretched the expensive meat, while the rice added additional filling that made the rolls substantial. The rolls required patience, separating cabbage leaves without tearing them, filling and rolling each one individually, arranging them in the pan, creating labor-intensive dish that demonstrated how much work went into making limited ingredients feed large families. Cabbage rolls appeared at Christmas dinner in households with Eastern European heritage, where the dish was traditional, and in households where mothers had learned that cabbage was cheap and filling, perfect for stretching expensive ingredients. The rolls represented immigrant foodways adapted to Depression economics. Fried cornmeal mush transformed leftover breakfast mush into new dish through slicing and frying, creating crispy outside, soft inside slices that could be breakfast, side dish, or even main course when topped with gravy. This versatile creation cost nothing beyond the original mush and demonstrated how one preparation could become multiple meals. Mothers made fried mush by pouring leftover hot mush into a loaf pan, cooling it until firm, then slicing it and frying the slices in bacon grease or butter until golden and crispy on both sides. The frying created textural transformation that made the mush seem like different food rather than just reheated leftovers. The fried mush could be served sweet with syrup or molasses, or savory with gravy, or alongside eggs and meat, demonstrating its versatility and ability to fit into different meals and different flavor profiles. This flexibility made fried mush valuable in households where variety was difficult to achieve with limited ingredients. 25 foods down, halfway complete. Salsify pretending to be oysters. Beet tops becoming vegetables. Cornmeal serving breakfast twice. Cabbage stretching meat eightfold. Yesterday's mush becoming today's crispy slices. These weren't just recipes, they were survival strategies, mathematical solutions to the problem of feeding families when money couldn't buy enough food. 25 more foods reveal the complete system. Oxtail soup brought rich, meaty flavor to Christmas dinner through oxtails that butchers sold cheaply because most customers didn't know how to use them. This economical creation cost about 30 cents and fed 8 people with soup that tasted like it contained expensive beef, despite using the cheapest cut available. Mothers made oxtail soup by browning oxtails, then simmering them for hours with vegetables and water until the meat fell from the bones and the broth became rich and gelatinous. The long cooking extracted every bit of flavor and nutrition from the bones, creating soup that was deeply satisfying. The oxtails required patient cooking. Quick cooking left them tough, and the broth thin, demonstrating that the cheapest cuts often required the most time, but created the most flavorful results when properly prepared. Rice pudding brought dessert to Christmas dinner through leftover rice, transformed into sweet, creamy pudding. This economical creation cost about 15 cents and fed 8 people with dessert that used rice that might otherwise be thrown away, demonstrating the waste-nothing philosophy that characterized Depression cooking. Mothers made rice pudding by mixing leftover cooked rice with milk, eggs, sugar, and vanilla, then baking until set and creamy. The rice absorbed the custard mixture, creating pudding that was thick and satisfying, with individual rice grains providing textural interest. The pudding could be served warm or cold, making it flexible for different meal timing and allowing it to be made ahead when Christmas Day cooking was already overwhelming. The versatility made rice pudding practical for holiday meals where timing was complicated. Rice pudding appeared in households where rice was an affordable staple. Navy bean soup brought protein and warmth to Christmas dinner through dried beans simmered with ham bone or salt pork until thick and creamy. This filling creation cost about 25 cents and fed 10 people with soup that was substantial enough to be main course when meat was unaffordable. Mothers made navy bean soup by soaking dried navy beans overnight, then simmering them with ham bone, onions, carrots, and celery until the beans were tender and beginning to break down, creating thick, creamy soup. The ham bone provided flavor and some meat that could be picked off and added back to the soup. The soup thickened as it cooked, with some beans breaking down and creating creamy base. Fried potatoes brought filling side dish to Christmas dinner through potatoes, sliced and fried in bacon grease until crispy and golden. This simple creation cost about 10 cents and fed 8 people with potatoes that tasted rich and satisfying, despite requiring only 2 ingredients. Mothers made fried potatoes by slicing raw potatoes thin, frying them in bacon grease over medium heat until golden and crispy on the outside and tender inside. The potatoes had to be turned carefully to brown evenly without breaking apart, requiring attention and skill. The bacon grease provided flavor that made plain potatoes taste special, demonstrating how fat could transform simple ingredients. Molasses cookies brought sweets to Christmas through cookies made with molasses instead of expensive sugar, creating dark, spicy cookies that were economical and long-lasting. This practical treat cost about 20 cents and produced 5 dozen cookies that could be stored for weeks without spoiling. Mothers made molasses cookies by mixing molasses with flour, butter, eggs when available, and spices, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, creating dough that was rolled, cut into shapes, and baked until firm. The molasses provided sweetness and moisture that kept the cookies soft and chewy. The cookies could be decorated with simple icing or left plain, depending on whether sugar was available for decoration. Plain cookies were just as satisfying and demonstrated that treats didn't require fancy decoration to be appreciated. 30 foods down, 20 remaining. Oxtails creating rich broth, leftover rice becoming pudding, beans serving as main course, potatoes crisping in bacon grease, molasses replacing sugar in cookies. Every dish solved a problem: how to stretch meat, use leftovers, provide protein cheaply, create satisfaction from fat, bake without expensive ingredients. 20 final foods complete Depression Christmas. Boiled dinner brought complete meal to Christmas table through one pot containing meat, potatoes, cabbage, carrots, and onions all cooked together. This economical creation cost about 50 cents and fed 8 people with meal that required only 1 pot and 1 fire, conserving fuel and effort. Mothers made boiled dinner by simmering corned beef or salt pork in water until tender, then adding potatoes, cabbage, carrots, and onions to cook in the flavorful broth. Everything cooked together, with the vegetables absorbing flavor from the meat and the broth becoming rich and savory. Cornbread stuffing brought traditional side dish to Christmas dinner through cornbread instead of expensive wheat bread, creating stuffing that was economical and distinctly Southern. This regional creation cost about 20 cents and fed 8 people with stuffing that was just as satisfying as wheat bread versions. Mothers made cornbread stuffing by crumbling day-old cornbread, mixing it with sautéed onions and celery, adding broth and seasonings, then baking until golden and crispy on top. The cornbread created different texture than wheat bread, slightly grainier, more crumbly, but equally delicious. The stuffing used cornbread that was already made, demonstrating how one preparation could serve multiple purposes. Pickled beets brought preserved vegetable to Christmas dinner through beets canned in fall and stored until winter when fresh vegetables were unavailable. This preserved creation cost about 15 cents to make in fall and provided vegetables throughout winter when fresh produce was impossible to afford. Mothers made pickled beets by cooking fresh beets until tender, peeling and slicing them, then packing them in jars with vinegar, sugar, and spices. The pickling preserved the beets and created sweet-sour flavor that was more interesting than plain cooked beets. The pickled beets were opened at Christmas, providing bright color and tangy flavor that cut through rich foods and provided contrast on the plate. Sauerkraut brought fermented vegetable to Christmas dinner through cabbage preserved through fermentation rather than canning. This economical creation cost almost nothing to make in fall and provided vitamin C throughout winter when fresh vegetables were unavailable, preventing scurvy and other deficiency diseases. Mothers made sauerkraut by shredding cabbage, mixing it with salt, packing it tightly in crocks, and allowing it to ferment for several weeks. The fermentation preserved the cabbage and created tangy, complex flavor that was distinctive and appealing to those who grew up eating it. Apple crisp brought dessert to Christmas dinner through apples topped with oat-based crumble instead of pie crust, saving the expense of butter and lard required for pastry. This economical creation cost about 25 cents and fed 8 people with dessert that was just as satisfying as pie, but required fewer expensive ingredients. Mothers made apple crisp by slicing apples into a baking dish, topping them with mixture of oats, flour, brown sugar, and butter, then baking until the apples were tender and the topping was crispy and golden. The oat topping created textural contrast and added whole grain nutrition that pie crust didn't provide. 35 foods down, 15 remaining. One-pot dinners conserving fuel, cornbread replacing wheat bread, fall preservation enabling winter eating, fermentation creating nutrition, oat toppings substituting for expensive pastry. These mothers understood chemistry, nutrition, preservation, and economics in ways that kept families fed and healthy when the economy had collapsed completely. 15 final foods complete the collection. Gingerbread brought spice cake to Christmas dessert through molasses-based cake that was economical and long-lasting. This practical creation cost about 30 cents and produced cake that served 12 people and that lasted for days without spoiling, making it ideal for holiday baking when treats needed to last through multiple days of celebration. Mothers made gingerbread by mixing molasses with flour, butter, eggs when available, and warming spices. Ginger, cinnamon, cloves, creating batter that baked into dark, moist cake. The molasses provided sweetness and moisture that kept the cake from drying out, while the spices created complex flavor that made the simple cake seem special. Potato soup brought filling first course to Christmas dinner through potatoes cooked in milk until thick and creamy. This economical creation cost about 15 cents and fed 8 people with soup that was warming and substantial, helping to fill stomachs before the main course. Mothers made potato soup by cooking diced potatoes with onions in water until tender, then adding milk and butter to create creamy soup. Some of the potatoes were mashed to thicken the soup, while others remained in chunks, creating textural variety. Coleslaw brought raw vegetable to Christmas dinner through shredded cabbage dressed with vinegar and sugar. This economical creation cost about 10 cents and fed 8 people with vegetable that was crunchy and refreshing, providing textural contrast to soft, cooked foods. Mothers made coleslaw by shredding cabbage fine, mixing it with dressing made from vinegar, sugar, and sometimes a little mayonnaise when available. The cabbage stayed crisp and provided crunch that balanced softer foods on the plate. The slaw had to be made shortly before serving, or the salt in the dressing would wilt the cabbage and create watery slaw that was unappetizing. Baking powder biscuits brought bread to Christmas table through quick bread that required no yeast and no rising time. This practical creation cost about 15 cents and produced 2 dozen biscuits that were tender and flaky, despite requiring only flour, baking powder, salt, fat, and milk. Mothers made baking powder biscuits by cutting cold fat into flour and baking powder, adding milk to create soft dough, rolling it out and cutting biscuits, then baking until golden. The biscuits were quick to make, requiring only about 30 minutes from start to finish. The biscuits were served hot with butter or gravy, creating bread that was substantial and satisfying. Betty brought apple dessert to Christmas dinner through apples layered with buttered breadcrumbs and baked until tender. This economical creation cost about 20 cents and fed 8 people with dessert that used stale bread productively while creating something that seemed special and celebratory. Mothers made Brown Betty by layering sliced apples with breadcrumbs that had been mixed with melted butter, sugar, and cinnamon, then baking until the apples were tender and the crumbs were golden and crispy. The breadcrumbs absorbed apple juice during baking, creating topping that was flavorful and substantial. 40 foods down, 10 remaining. Molasses cake lasting days. Potato soup filling stomachs strategically. Raw cabbage providing crunch. Quick biscuits requiring no yeast. Stale bread becoming dessert topping. Every dish demonstrated understanding of nutrition, timing, preservation, and economics that kept families fed when most Americans were hungry. 10 final foods reveal the complete Depression Christmas table. Pork and beans brought protein and substance to Christmas dinner through navy beans baked with small pieces of salt pork, creating dish that was filling and economical when fresh meat was unaffordable. This Depression staple cost about 30 cents and fed 10 people with beans that were rich and savory, despite containing very little actual meat. Mothers made pork and beans by soaking dried navy beans overnight, then baking them with chunks of salt pork, molasses, brown sugar, and mustard for 6 to 8 hours at low temperature. The long, slow cooking broke down the beans and allowed the pork fat to render and flavor everything, creating dish that tasted meaty despite containing mostly beans. This is the dish the hook promised would show you what mothers knew about creating abundance from scarcity. Stuffing made from stale bread and bacon drippings, transforming what would otherwise be garbage into side dish that tasted rich and special. Bread stuffing with bacon drippings brought traditional Christmas side to tables where butter was too expensive for proper stuffing. This economical creation cost about 15 cents and fed 8 people with stuffing that was just as flavorful as butter-based versions, despite using fat that was saved from breakfast bacon rather than purchased specifically for stuffing. Mothers made bread stuffing by tearing stale bread into small pieces, mixing it with sautéed onions and celery that had been cooked in bacon drippings, adding broth and seasonings, then baking until golden and crispy on top. The bacon drippings provided rich, smoky flavor that made the stuffing taste special and celebratory, despite using saved fat rather than expensive butter. The stale bread was essential. Fresh bread created gummy stuffing that was unpleasant to eat, while properly stale bread absorbed the liquid without becoming mushy, creating stuffing with good texture. Chicken and dumplings brought comfort food to Christmas dinner through one old hen stretched to feed 8 people through dumplings that absorbed the chicken broth and created filling meal from minimal meat. This economical creation cost about 50 cents and demonstrated how flour and water could multiply chicken's serving capacity. Mothers made chicken and dumplings by simmering an old stewing hen, too tough for roasting but perfect for long cooking, until the meat was tender and falling from the bones. The chicken was removed, the meat picked off and set aside, and the bones returned to the pot to simmer longer and extract every bit of flavor and gelatin. The dumplings were made from flour, baking powder, salt, and milk or water, creating soft dough that was dropped by spoonfuls into the simmering broth. The dumplings cooked in the broth, absorbing flavor and swelling to several times their original size, creating substantial filling that stretched the small amount of chicken meat. Sweet potato casserole brought Southern tradition to Christmas tables through mashed sweet potatoes baked with butter and sugar, creating side dish that was substantial and filling enough to serve as main course when meat was absent. This versatile creation cost about 35 cents and fed 8 people with sweet potatoes that tasted rich and satisfying. Mothers made sweet potato casserole by baking sweet potatoes until soft, mashing them with butter, sugar, and milk, then spreading the mixture in a baking dish and baking until heated through and slightly caramelized on top. The sweet potatoes' natural sweetness was enhanced by added sugar, creating dish that tasted almost like dessert, but that counted as vegetable. The casserole could be made with fresh sweet potatoes when available and affordable, or with canned sweet potatoes when fresh were too expensive or unavailable. The canned version was actually easier because the potatoes were already cooked and just needed mashing and seasoning, demonstrating that convenience foods sometimes made economical sense during Depression. The casserole was substantial enough to serve as main course when topped with nuts or served alongside beans, demonstrating that meat wasn't essential to satisfying meal if other protein sources were available and if dishes were filling enough to satisfy hunger. Cornmeal pancakes brought filling breakfast to Christmas morning through pancakes made primarily from cornmeal rather than expensive wheat flour. This economical creation cost about 10 cents and fed 6 people with pancakes that were hearty and substantial, sticking to ribs and keeping families full until dinner. Mothers made cornmeal pancakes by mixing cornmeal with small amount of wheat flour, baking powder, salt, eggs when available, and milk or water, creating batter that was thicker and grainier than regular pancake batter. The cornmeal created pancakes with more texture and more corn flavor than wheat pancakes, making them distinctive and filling. The pancakes were cooked on a hot griddle greased with bacon drippings, creating crispy edges and slightly crunchy texture that made them more interesting than soft, fluffy wheat pancakes. The bacon flavor from the griddle added savory note that complemented the corn's sweetness. The pancakes were served with molasses or sorghum syrup rather than expensive maple syrup, creating sweet topping that was affordable and traditional in many regions. The dark, strong-flavored syrups matched the cornmeal's robust flavor better than delicate maple syrup would have. 45 foods down, 5 remaining. Salt pork flavoring beans, stale bread becoming stuffing, dumplings stretching chicken, sweet potatoes serving as main course, cornmeal creating filling pancakes. You've witnessed complete survival system, nothing wasted, everything stretched, creativity substituting for money, celebration happening despite poverty. 5 final foods, complete Depression Christmas. Rice and gravy brought filling main course to Christmas dinner through rice topped with meat gravy, creating dish that was substantial enough to satisfy hunger when meat itself was too scarce to serve as centerpiece. This economical creation cost about 20 cents and fed 8 people with rice, that tasted rich and meaty despite containing very little actual meat. Mothers made rice and gravy by cooking rice until fluffy and tender, then topping it with gravy made from pan drippings, flour, and water or milk. The gravy contained small amounts of meat or just meat flavor from the drippings, creating sauce that made plain rice seem like complete meal. The gravy was the key. It had to be flavorful enough and rich enough to make the rice satisfying despite the minimal meat content. Mothers learned to extract maximum flavor from small amounts of drippings, understanding that browning the flour properly and seasoning carefully could create gravy that tasted meaty and rich even when actual meat was nearly absent. The rice absorbed the gravy, creating dish where every grain was coated with flavor, making the rice interesting and satisfying rather than just bland filler. The absorption also meant that gravy that seemed thin when poured over rice became properly thick as the rice soaked it up. Fried cabbage brought vegetables to Christmas dinner through cabbage cooked in bacon grease until tender and slightly caramelized. This economical creation cost about 10 cents and fed 8 people with cabbage that was flavorful and satisfying, despite being one of the cheapest vegetables available. Mothers made fried cabbage by shredding cabbage, then cooking it in bacon grease over medium heat until it wilted and began to brown slightly. The browning created sweet, caramelized flavor that made the cabbage more interesting than boiled cabbage, while the bacon grease provided rich, smoky flavor that made simple vegetables seem special. The cabbage had to be cooked long enough to become tender and develop some caramelization, but not so long it became mushy and overcooked. This timing required attention and experience, with mothers learning to recognize when cabbage reached perfect doneness by its appearance and smell. The bacon grease was essential. Without it, fried cabbage was just cooked cabbage, but with it, the dish became something rich and satisfying. The fat coated every strand of cabbage, creating richness that made the vegetable filling and appealing rather than just something to eat, because vegetables were required. Bread and butter pickles brought preserved vegetables to Christmas dinner through cucumbers canned in fall with sweet sour brine. This preserved creation cost about 20 cents to make in fall and provided vegetables throughout winter, demonstrating that Christmas abundance came from summer and fall preservation rather than winter purchasing. Mothers made bread and butter pickles by slicing cucumbers and onions thin, soaking them in salted water to draw out moisture, then packing them in jars with brine made from vinegar, sugar, and pickling spices. The pickles were processed in boiling water bath to seal the jars, creating preserved vegetables that lasted through winter. The pickles provided crunch and bright flavor that cut through rich Christmas foods, creating palate-cleansing contrast that made heavy meals more comfortable to eat. The sweet-sour flavor appealed to children who might refuse plain vegetables, but who enjoyed pickles' distinctive taste. Mashed potatoes brought filling side dish to Christmas dinner through potatoes mashed with milk and butter, creating comfort food that was economical and universally appealing. This simple creation cost about 15 cents and fed 8 people with potatoes that were creamy and satisfying, despite requiring only 3 ingredients. Mothers made mashed potatoes by boiling peeled potatoes until tender, draining them thoroughly, then mashing them with milk and butter until smooth and creamy. The mashing had to be thorough. Lumpy mashed potatoes announced careless preparation, but not excessive, as over-mashing created gluey texture that was unpleasant. The milk and butter amounts were adjusted based on availability and affordability, with more of each creating richer, creamier potatoes, but also increasing cost. During Depression, mothers learned to use minimal amounts while still creating potatoes that seemed creamy and rich, understanding that technique mattered as much as ingredient quantity. Water gravy completed the collection by demonstrating the ultimate Depression-era substitution, gravy made with water instead of milk. when even milk was too expensive, creating sauce from flour, fat, and water that made plain food palatable when nothing else was available. Water gravy brought moisture and flavor to Christmas dinner through gravy that cost almost nothing and that transformed dry bread or potatoes into something approaching a meal. This desperate creation cost about 2 cents and demonstrated what mothers did when poverty eliminated even basic ingredients like milk. Mothers made water gravy by creating roux from flour and bacon grease or other saved fat, cooking it until golden, then gradually adding water while stirring constantly to prevent lumps. The gravy thickened as it cooked, creating sauce that was thinner and less rich than milk gravy, but that was better than nothing. The gravy's flavor came entirely from the fat and from careful browning of the flour. There was no milk or meat to provide richness or complexity. Mothers learned to brown the flour carefully, understanding that proper browning created flavor that partially compensated for the lack of milk and meat. The gravy was served over bread, potatoes, or biscuits, creating meal that was filling, if not particularly satisfying. The gravy provided moisture that made dry food easier to eat and created impression of more substantial meal than plain bread or potatoes alone would provide.